Good morning. Welcome. My name's Chuck Lewis, Executive Director of the Center for Public Integrity. And before I start, I want to tell everyone that this is the only room they had. We don't normally get the paneling. The Center for Public Integrity is a group of concerned Americans who want to better understand ethics-related issues that affect this nation. We are a nonprofit research organization with an advisory board of distinguished Americans. We opened our offices here in Washington in May 1990. The Center is supported by contributions from foundations, corporations, labor unions, and individuals, as well as earned revenue from news organizations. The Center publishes investigative studies which serve as a vital reference material for journalists, academicians, and policymakers alike. The purpose of the Center is to bring important, sometimes inaccessible information to the attention of the American people. Today, we are releasing our 9th Center report, Private Parties, Political Party Leadership in Washington's Mercenary Culture. It's an investigative study about the men who have led the Democratic and Republican National Committees since 1977. Based on scores of interviews and various federal, state, and city records from around the country, this provocative Center study reveals conflicts of interest of several party chairmen for the last 15 years. The national political parties are nearly always in the news, especially in this presidential election year, but seldom are the activities and business relationships of their leaders ever examined, and certainly not in a detailed, methodical, comparative manner. The Center interviewed 9 of the 10 living persons who have led the Democratic and Republican parties since 1977. Only one official, current DNC Chairman Ronald Brown, declined to be interviewed. Thomas Jefferson once said, "When a man assumes a public trust, he should consider himself public property." Today in Washington, the leaders of America's political parties are power players of the first order. And yet, we do not look upon these officials or their organizations as public entities with attendant public responsibilities. There appear to be no ethics or conflict of interest guidelines for top party officials. Party chairmen are not required to file financial disclosure forms. Indeed, in general, public disclosure is at a minimum because the parties are private corporations. There also are no post-employment restrictions on where the chairman can work after leaving the party. Basically, since 1977, unless a party chairman died or left Washington, he became a lobbyist. While most Americans regard the parties as aloof and irrelevant to their everyday concerns, and voter identification with political parties is quite low, the fact is the political parties today are the largest political machines in U.S. history. In the past 15 years, the national party structures based in Washington have grown and flourished, building strong, resilient, multi-million-dollar financial bases and effectively utilizing technological advances in polling, computer databases, direct mail, solicitation, and so forth. The leaders of these large modern organizations are the chairmen of the Democratic and Republican National Committees. These chairmen meet frequently with the President if they are from the same party. Chairmen also meet with congressional leaders of the same party. For example, current Democratic National Committee Chairman Ron Brown frequently attends the Speaker of the House's closed-door Deputy Whip meetings on Wednesday mornings in the Capitol, where legislative strategy, the upcoming agenda, and vote counts are frankly discussed. That might seem perfectly reasonable if it were not for the fact that throughout his DNC tenure, Ron Brown has also been a paid partner in the law firm of Patton, Boggs & Blow, inside lobbyist with 1,500 active clients, including the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, the owners of the notorious Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. Not only has Brown received income from his firm while serving as DNC chairman, he has maintained business relationships with at least 3 private companies. He has solicited government business for both his law firm and the company he heads, and he has even traveled to Japan on law firm business. The chairman of the Democratic Party has not been straight with his own party or the public at large. Ron Brown has repeatedly stated that as DNC chairman, he has spent 100% of his time promoting the party's interests. However, the Center has found that this is simply not true. According to public documents signed by Ron Brown, he has represented the city of Denver as a lobbyist. He has personally appeared before District of Columbia government officials to try to land a contract for the firm he founded and heads, Capital PepsiCo. Indeed, Brown has signed numerous proposals, contracts, and other correspondence between the city and his company since 1989. And the National PepsiCo company in Columbus, Ohio told us that Ron Brown is a business development advisor who can, quote, open the door, unquote, and, quote, lend credibility, unquote, when PepsiCo solicits business in a new jurisdiction. And while DNC Chairman Ron Brown signed and sent at least one letter on Patton Boggs and Blow stationery to D.C. government officials proposing to do municipal bond work for the District of Columbia. Finally, the firm on whose board Ron Brown served, ChemFix, is under criminal investigation in New York, and correspondence between Brown and the City of New York have been subpoenaed. I could go on and on. The headline here is that of the 11 elected party chairmen since 1977, no party chairman has raised more questions about potential conflicts of interest than the current chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Ron Brown, which is not to say that this is exclusively a Democratic Party problem. It is not. Although the party charters stipulate that the position of chairman is full-time, since 1977, roughly half the elected National Party chairmen have received outside income from corporations or law firms during their tenures. Besides Brown, those chairmen include Democrats Charles Manat, Paul Kirk, and Republicans Frank Fahrenkopf and Clayton Yiter. The mindset of the leaders of these private corporations is disturbing. Take RNC Chairman Rich Bond, for example. Although he said he does not receive any outside income, Bond still is part owner of his Washington area lobbying firm, Bond Donatelli. Bond told us he sees no violation of the public trust in simultaneously being a paid partner in a lobbying firm and the chairman of the party. However, for Bond, it is, quote, much easier to make the financial sacrifice than to leave myself, the party, and the president open to irresponsible charges or to inaccurate charges. So it's easier just to forego than it is to be pounded, unquote. We also found that since 1977, half the party chairmen have been registered with the Justice Department either before or after their party tenures as foreign agents for overseas corporations and governments. In the unique ambiance of Washington, the intertwining of politics and commerce is routine and well understood, and the political parties are an integral part of this mercenary culture. In Washington, like any political machine, the major parties merchandise access to power. Nowhere is the sale of insiderism more blatant than at the national party conventions. Both political parties solicited and received huge sums of money from multi-billion-dollar corporations. And what did those corporate interests get in return? The same thing they always get when they dump large sums of money into our political process: access and influence in Washington. As Legal Times reported, American Express, Time Warner, AT&T, and the New York Telephone Company each contributed more than $400,000 in cash and other support to help the Democrats pay for their convention in New York. For several $1,000s, you could buy a ticket on the special Democratic Victory Train from Washington's Union Station to New York City. Lobbyists had 3 hours of uninterrupted access to Democratic members of Congress. When asked about this event, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee Chief of Staff, Joan Baggett, told me that the Victory Train and the scores of receptions in New York were done to, quote, essentially service our donors, unquote. In Houston, at the Republican convention, DuPont, Conoco, Exxon, Shell Oil, Pennzoil, and the Enron Corporation each contributed $250,000 or more to help support the many Republican receptions and gala events. Big Democratic donor AT&T also put up $450,000 in cash and other support for the GOP convention. Several corporations hedged their bets and hosted events at both conventions. Philip Morris sponsored a major luncheon attended by President Bush and Vice President Quayle, and of course Philip Morris Senior Vice President Craig Fuller was the manager of this convention. In Houston, corporate interests from 4 industries, RJR Nabisco, Southern Pacific, Coastal Corporation, and the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, threw 4 separate parties for Senate Minority Leader Robert Dole of Kansas. Today in Washington, the ethical lines are blurred on this and many other issues. When asked about the conflict of interest issues surrounding DNC Chairman Ron Brown, the managing partner of his law firm, Patton Boggs and Blow, Timothy May, said the idea is ridiculous that, quote, someone is chairman of a party and has influence and that they can't employ this influence to help clients. There's no problem. It only gets into conflict of interest when helping the client would damage the interests of the party, unquote. It is becoming increasingly obvious in this country that the interests of the party reside with the large corporations and law firms. John Q. Public is out of luck. No victory trains, no meetings with the president or cabinet members, no lavish receptions where the powerful mingle. His phone calls and letters somehow just don't get answered. There's probably no more famous political machine in American folklore than New York City's notorious Tammany Hall and its boss, George Washington Plunkett. At the beginning of the century, he made his fortune in politics by buying property that he knew would in advance would escalate in price because of a planned subway line. However, this was not outright corruption, Plunkett said, but honest graft. As he put it, I seen my opportunities and I took them. Plunkett is long gone, but his credo lives on. Regarding today's national political machines, quite a few people see their opportunities, and they have been taking them. And despite the myths about post-Watergate government accountability, these party animals are all operating within the very wide confines of the law. Thank you. Before taking questions, I want to just very briefly thank the people who helped with this effort, especially Sam Lowenberg, Diane Renzulli, also Margaret Ibrahim, Bill Hogan, and other researchers who interviewed the chairman along with Sam Lowenberg, David DePiro, Meredith Reed, and Susan Smith. Okay, questions? Yeah?
What are your major recommendations for changing the situation as you see it?
Right. We do have recommendations, and we frequently do recommendations here at the center. I want to caution, we're not a lobbying group. I mean, we don't consider ourselves a citizen lobby that advocates specific legislation. This situation seems so obvious to me that I have no problem suggesting recommendations, but I don't know what we would do to try to implement those, and it's not ours to do. It seems apparent to me both charters have rules that say that the chairman must be full-time. And many chairmen we interviewed, specifically Bill Brock, Dick Richards, and a few others, feel strongly that that means you don't do anything else. You don't receive money from anybody else. You do that full-time, 60 hours, 70 hours, 100 hours a week. That's all you do. It seems to me that the party charters need to be tightened up. The issue of full-time, it seems fairly self-explanatory, but apparently it's been, it's vague to some people, or some people are doing whatever they want to do, basically. So the parties need to assert themselves in this issue. When the national committees meet in January and new chairmen are considered for new terms, perhaps these gatherings will think about this issue, and they'll make sure they get chairmen who are not doing 6 other things on the side and are not making money because of their position, and their law firms are not putting out stationery that has their name and says that they're chairman of the party, and it's not a marketing tool. And so, first of all, the full-time situation needs to be clarified, because in the last 5–10 years it's clearly getting out of hand and people are ignoring that. The second thing, which I think is an issue, in our dealings with both parties, I think disclosure, to be perfectly blunt about it, is a joke. There is no financial disclosure. Despite all the research we did about these various chairmen, and you have all the biographies in the back, we don't know how much these chairmen make from these sources. We don't know specifically what Fahrenkopf or Manat or Brown got from their law firms each year. We ought to know that. It's relevant. What if it's 800,000? What if it's 200,000? I think the public has a right to know what the heads of the national political parties are making from all these sources. So why is it that there is no financial disclosure for them as opposed to all the other 10,000 employees in the executive branch and on the Hill? It's not just that. Those are easy for me. I have no problem ever with disclosure. Then you get into some other issues. Should you have things like post-employment restrictions for party chairmen? That's a whole other issue, and I don't know what I think. There are First Amendment issues. They are entitled to pretty much do what they want. Congress cannot do post-employment restrictions regarding its existing federal employees. I can't imagine them attempting to do it with private parties, so that's probably impractical. But the others are fully practical, I think. To implement and enforce the full-time chairman rule and to try to clean up this situation, I think that's perfectly reasonable to do. I think disclosure is perfectly reasonable. One of the chairmen we interviewed, Frank Fahrenkopf, said that the parties and the people who run the parties are quote-unquote private folks, and these are private corporations, and we set our own standards. Well, I'm standing here and going directly in the face of that, and I'm saying that's ridiculous. These parties affect millions of people, They have millions of members. They dispense tens of millions of dollars, and there's absolutely no reason why they should be exempted from all these disclosures. So those are some of the things.
Although they may be practical suggestions, are they realistic, Mr. Lewis? Do you think that there's any chance that they would want to take those measures?
I don't know. There could be a new breeze coming through this town. I don't know. I really don't know how practical. There are people giving lip service to being concerned about influence peddling. I don't know if it's lip service or that's genuinely felt, but it's hard to stand here in September of '92 and predict what will happen in the next 6 months and who will care about what. I don't think most Americans really know a lot of what we've discussed here. Most people don't. The chairmen are not household names. People don't focus on who runs the parties and their potential conflicts. Part of the problem before anyone can do anything is that the public's got to learn about this, and they've got to understand that there might be a problem here before there's enough impetus and force and momentum for anyone to change anything. So we're at the early stages of the curve. Insiders in Washington and people who follow these issues closely have known about some of these issues for a few years. In the case of Ron Brown, there's been substantial reporting about some of these conflict issues. But it's always in a fairly limited way regarding him or his particular situation or his company. Very few people have looked at the whole picture and look at that as a systemic problem. It is a systemic problem. Ron Brown is not an aberration. He is a metaphor in many ways for how serious it can be. Yeah.
The political parties are essentially a private organization, not government in terms of the public interest relationship that you note. Many of these stories, of course, about Mr. Fahrenkopf, Mr. Brown, we've seen in the papers, been printed all around the country. There doesn't seem to be a hue and cry from the members who voluntarily join this party and support Mr. Brown and support their party. Can you point to any group within the party who is angry about this, who has complained about this, who feels that he should not be receiving outside income from a former firm that he's going to be returning to? That has made a big stink about this?
Well, it's a good question. Some of the chairmen that we spoke with find this outrageous and offensive. We had Republican chairmen criticizing other Republican chairmen. We had them also, of course, criticizing the Democrats. In the case of Ron Brown, when he was elected in '89, there was a substantial constituency in the labor groups that were very upset about Ron Brown's lobbying activities. And some of the opposition to Ron Brown was because of this exact issue. What I'm trying to say here is there are constituencies that are not happy about this phenomenon. You're right about the private corporations. They are private corporations. What I'm suggesting is it should be a public issue, and it is a public. It involves the public trust. I also, I guess what I'm concerned about is some of these issues are not that well known. The paper that principally broke the Ron Brown affair was Newsday. A lot of people don't know about the Chemfix thing in great detail. Now, it's true 2020 did do a segment on national television, which is several million people, but these things kind of fade into the air very quickly. Frank Fahrenkopf, Evans and Novak did a column about Toyota. A lot of people don't read Evans and Novak in this country. The mainstream of America necessarily doesn't know it. I'm not convinced that it's exactly filtered into the consciousness, so to speak. I mean, yeah, there have been lots of, we have a disadvantage these days with all these computer databases. We can find all these obscure stories that have appeared everywhere. We may have seen some of them, and we automatically then assume that everyone knows these things. I'm convinced most people don't know most of these things. Yeah.
The point is that the people who are the rank and file of the party, the activists, forgive me if I have a mistake here, but I haven't seen any groundswell or even a minor swell within the ranks saying this is terrible that he works for a law firm or that he maintains connections or that he goes back to that law firm or lobbies. Right. I haven't seen any of those stories.
No,
have you seen that?
No,
or,
I'm not suggesting.
And if they don't care, then why should the larger public care?
There isn't. I don't want to give the wrong impression. There is not a groundswell. That's true, but there isn't. I guess it would be nice if there was a groundswell. I think there should be a groundswell. I think that the people that are privately talking about this should be publicly talking about it. And I am suggesting that there is a window of opportunity here. Both chairmen are probably leaving at the end of this year, and those committees are going to meet. And whether or not there's a groundswell, we all know how politics works. A lot of it's in the corridors, and a lot of it's mumbled over lunch, and a lot of people talk, but they don't go public about it. If a guy's running for chairman and he's got endorsements by Mario Cuomo, Ted Kennedy, and someone else, I forget. I mean, if you've got all your ducks in a row to the point where everyone else withdraws, who's going to make an issue of that? Suddenly it's a unanimous situation. You want to be on the wrong side of the future party leader. So any attempts at a groundswell kind of kind of dissipate very quickly. I guess the reason, your larger question is why should anyone care if there's not a groundswell? That's the in general, so what question, which is an important one. The reason we did the study, and the reason I think it's an important thing, is I think it represents a distortion of the political process. If people at the highest levels of our government, access to the President, the Speaker of the House, all these people, are also bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars to themselves and their law firms because of their associations, it only reinforces the public perception that corporations and law firms control our government, and distort our political process, and the average citizen is left out in the cold. There is a perception that the average citizen, if they didn't give $5,000 or $10,000, or they're not part of the presidential roundtable, or this group or that group, or they didn't go on the victory train, they're not going to be heard. They're going to get a perfunctory letter back, thank you for your letter. And when you see the Ross Perot phenomenon, a person outside the two-party system, and you see the polls about what people think of Washington, and you see that 50% or less of the people in this country vote, and you see that 100 million people or more don't fill out their census forms or vote or pay taxes, and there's this huge disenfranchised, alienated mass of voters out there, these issues are directly relevant because they're starting to feel as though their government is somehow apart from them. And this is not original. I mean, there have been some wonderful books in the last 2 or 3 years on this whole theme. The Bartlett and Steele American Went Wrong book, and Bill Grider's Who Will Tell the People the Betrayal of American Democracy. Both of these books have gotten at this theme. Some of our studies have looked at some of these issues also. We did a study about campaign finance that looked at 6 issues that affect every American, and we showed how when money went into Congress, things didn't even make it to the floor. I mean, obvious issues that 80% Gallup poll people would say do this, it ended up happening over here, nothing happened, and there's no question, we're not going to reinvent the wheel this morning. We all know that there's been a lot of discussion about this, and the issue is access and influence and its corrosive effect on the process. That's why it matters. And if people don't have a groundswell within the parties, then people outside the parties ought to start talking about it, because like it or not, these are the parties are fundamental to everyone, including those not closely affiliated with the parties. They control our candidates, they control our whole democracy and our whole electoral process. So this is a fundamental interest to every American, not just the party regulars.
Let me go back for a moment to the recommendations you made. You didn't mention the large sums of money that corporations pour into the Democratic and Republican National Conventions. As you know, they also receive money from the government, just as the presidential candidates to stage their conventions. And I was just wondering whether you thought that there ought to be some curbs on outside contributions in those huge amounts to the two parties to stage their conventions.
We didn't address that in our study specifically. It's a very good question. I have to tell you, when I first heard that these corporations were putting in that kind of money, I was stunned. Just when you think you've heard everything, you hear something else. And I have to admit, it happened in '88 and may have happened in other years. It's not the first year this has happened. I think what you're suggesting or what you're bringing up goes to a much larger issue, which is really troublesome, the Federal Election Campaign Act and the Federal Election Commission. And most people who track campaign finance and these ethics issues are very frustrated with the FEC and the disclosure process. There are so many loopholes in this system now, it is just a farce. When you have tens of millions being donated in with soft money to both parties, not in addition to this corporation stuff at the conventions. I mean, the idea in the post-Watergate years of a person giving $1,000 and having all these limits, it seems naive now to look back and see what's happened. It's ballooned completely out of control. And one of my favorite greatest hits, amazing stories that I we're actually working on, and we're going to discuss in a future study, but I can just mention it briefly. We've all heard about and read about Michael Kojima, the largest single donor to the Republican Party this year, $500,000. He's a fugitive from justice. He's bankrupt. There are 4 or 5 civil lawsuits against him, and yet he's seated at a table with George Bush, and no one knows where this money came from. That is the problem here. We don't know who, we know, some of the times we know who gives the money. Sometimes we're not sure who gives the money, and most of the time we don't exactly know what they got in return for it. But there's very little question, I don't think in anyone's mind, that they do get something. My favorite story in this study was an interview with former Chairman John White. Years ago, the Democratic Party had a massive debt in the wake of the '68 campaign, and they were, you know, in terrible financial situation there. And John White said that it was possible they might have to shut the party offices down, lose their office space, and fire all their people, which he said would be acutely embarrassing. And they needed someone to write a check quickly to avert total disaster. And he told me that the person they found was Lew Wasserman, the head of MCA, who wrote a big check, and they were able to stay afloat. So I said to him, well, did Wasserman ever call in his chips? I mean, what did he ever ask for later? And he said, well, he didn't really ask for anything. I can't remember them ever really wanting anything for that. And I said, really? And he said, well, there was this one time. Lew Wasserman was in Washington and he couldn't get a hotel room. So he asked John White to help out. Did they have any rooms at the Madison? And so White's calling around Washington trying to find a good room for him in a nice hotel. They're all full up, I guess, or something was happening. So he said, we didn't have any choice. We put him up in the White House in the Lincoln bedroom. And he said, it wasn't a big thing, of course. And I said, oh, no. But I mean, this is what we're talking about. This is, you can't get any closer to the president than the Lincoln bedroom. I mean, this is the issue here, access and influence. People don't talk about these chairmen. They have enormous access. They have enormous influence. They're frequently meeting with all these people, and I'm just suggesting we need to look at them more closely and in a systemic way, not necessarily a specific personal way. Any other? Yeah.
You've mentioned that you had interviews with several of the former party chairmen or current ones. Did you find all of them to be cooperative with the study and its dissemination?
Well, most of the 9 who agreed to be interviewed, I have to give them credit. They were cooperative. They took the time to meet with us. Rich Bond, less than 2 weeks before the convention in Houston, sat down with us, which I was impressed with. Some of them disagreed with the point of the study. Folks like Fahrenkopf and others, I don't think, were crazy about where we were coming from, and they disagreed with some of the ideas we were questioning. And I mean, he didn't see what the big deal was, I guess, is what I'm getting at. But in general, they were very cooperative. We did encounter some people under bond at the RNC were very frustrated with us, and we were frustrated with them, and there was some angry correspondence, and the RNC, there were some elaborate steps that they took to try to demonstrate their unhappiness with the center, which I can amplify further at some point. And on the Democratic side, we tried for over 2 months to meet with Ron Brown. I would estimate our phone calls and letters probably exceed the number 20 to the DNC to try to obtain an interview with Ron Brown. And we flat out did not succeed. He ducked us. There's no other way to put it. I'm convinced that he could have found a way to meet with us, and he did not. We did meet with the Chief of Staff to the DNC, and we did meet with the head of Patton Boggs and Blow. So we got, I thought, a fairly good perspective on what he does and his point of view, which we try to reflect fairly in the study. But what I'm trying to say is the individual chairman, the former chairman, were all, including the current Republican chairman, were all cooperative personally. The RNC organization around Bond was not that happy about this, and especially Ron Brown just simply did not want to deal with us. In long-winded answer to your question there. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you add more detail. You mentioned that your center is funded by contributions from foundations, corporations, labor unions, and individuals. Can you specify for this study in particular where your funding came from?
Sure. First of all, I make available to anyone an itemized list of all our contributors. We're one of the few groups in Washington that has no problem revealing all of our donors. After this morning with this room, it's going to be a lot lower, our cash balance. But most of our funding comes from foundations. Our largest foundation is the Schumann Foundation, headed by Bill Moyers. We have other foundation money that we've gotten from the Town Creek Foundation, the Deer Creek Foundation, depending on what year, MacArthur Foundation, Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation has been with us from the beginning. We do consulting for some television interests, PBS and one of the networks, and we sell our studies, which brings in some revenue, not as much as we'd like to work on that aspect. And we do get money from labor and business, and there are quite a few unions and a few companies, and I can give all that to you later if you'd like. Any other questions? Yeah.
Elaborate, you said you could, on the elaborate steps that the RNC took to, did they try to stymie this study?
Well, okay, I will elaborate in great detail. And in fact, I can provide correspondence if that's of interest. We, in addition to meeting with the chairman of the current parties, we felt I mean, it's one thing to go to all these former chairmen, but you've got an added obligation in gathering this information, obviously at the party structure itself. We wanted to meet with and talk extensively with the general counsels to both parties to find out what their ethics and conflict of interest guidelines were, if they had any at all, for example, what they thought about the full-time rule in the charter, and did they have concerns about this, had it come up in meetings, et cetera, et cetera. We did have some success, although it was limited, in talking to the DNC general counsel. When we tried to meet with the RNC general counsel, Mr. Ginsburg, to make a long story short, or shorter, he was unable to find the time to meet with us over a 2-month period. At one point, as we were getting close to going to the printer with the study, we sent a letter to him and we said, look, we really want to talk to you. These are important issues. We think this is the case. You have no guidelines for ethics. You have no guidelines for conflicts of interest. And you have a full-time charter that it is in your party rules. This is what we think is the case. And we also think that you flat out are declining to interview with us, to meet with us. If we don't hear from you in 2 weeks, we'll write that that's what happened, because we had a deadline. He wrote a very angry letter back several weeks later saying that this was unfair and unreasonable, and he had a convention to put on, and these were bullying techniques, tactics, I think was the phrase. And he took the unusual step of sending this letter to every member of the Center for Public Integrity Advisory Board, the Arthur Schlesingers and Hiding Carters of the world. And so then I naturally sent another letter back to him, answering his letter and sending it also to the advisory board. It's a fairly unusual move. I don't think it's the first time people have contacted our advisory board, but it is the first time before a study. And I have to say, in general, there's more pressure before a study. This is our 9th study in the past little less than 2 years. We had more pressure on this study than any other study, easily. We received unsolicited calls from various folks in addition to these letters, and so that's the explanation there, and I can provide the correspondence if that's of interest. Any other questions?
Did your advisory board intervene at that point?
No, they didn't. I think at this point they're starting to wear helmets and flak jackets, and I think they got the letter, and I think maybe they're getting used to, I mean, some of our studies have been a little controversial, and I don't know what exactly happened. Make a long story short, I did not hear back from my advisory board. No one said, what's the problem here? I mean, the letter apparently had no effect that I'm aware of, at least. And, you know, we may have more letters in the coming days. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is it your position that the parties have evolved into this sort of relationship? Or, I mean, to me, it doesn't surprise me.
Right.
In your studies.
I think, Well, the problem is we went from 77 on, and I got to tell you, it's very funny. Most people said, well, did you look at George Bush when he was chairman in 72? Did you look at Robert Strauss when he was chairman in 75? And you'll see we have a historical section that goes back 200 years. It's very, very brief. It's a page or two. It's not what I would call in-depth. But we do talk about campaign finance issues vis-a-vis the parties. And yes, these issues have been with us a long time. The specific issue of what the chairman makes, these party structures did not evolve into their current form with large organizations with hundreds of employees and million-dollar budgets really until the late 50s into the 60s. So it's a relatively, in the last 30, 40 years that this has evolved in terms of those structures. So you can't go too far back looking at the national party organizations. And in that context, I suspect there were other chairmen who probably made money in the 60s and 70s. We just didn't go back that far. I think the amounts of money are larger now than they ever have been, just in campaigns in general and in the parties in general. And for all these reasons, that's why we did what we did. The other thing I wanted to point out, it's very important, because we didn't want to work on it for several years, well, it could be an interesting topic, of course, but we did not, we could have focused, for example, on the deputy chairman. We could have focused on the finance chairman. We could have focused on the head of the Republican and Democratic senatorial committees and the congressional committees that raise millions and millions of dollars and are all adjuncts to the party apparatus itself, part of the party apparatus. All of these people, many of them have other interests. The finance chairmen for both political parties have jobs in real life that they do. Ron Brown was a lobbyist for the government of Haiti when Baby Doc Duvalier was in power, and he was simultaneously the deputy chairman of the DNC in the early 80s. What I'm trying to say is we went in at the high levels of the chairman. We could have spent a lot more time and done, we did 11 chairmen. We could have done 35 or 40 top party officials over the same period of time, and we would have found everything we found today times 10. That's my impression, at least, from stories I've heard and anecdotes that have come our way. But anyway, back to the basic point of your question, I don't know how bad it was before the 50s or 60s because of the way they've evolved. I do think it's probably more serious now because the amounts of money are larger, and it stands out that there's no disclosure with these folks. That's stunning to me, and that's in the last 10 or 15 years in the post-Watergate accountability legislation stuff. So that's what makes it different, and that's why I think it's relevant now. Any other questions?